And that's, to me, beautiful. Like that, in a time of artistic abundance, when everything is available on a dot, I love the people who are like, it doesn't have to be that way. It's not for you. You don't get this just because you want it. That, to me, is both an artistic choice. It's also a political choice.
Hello, and welcome to Art Restart, where we learn from artists who, wherever they work, whatever they make, are shaking up the status quo in their fields and in their communities. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, which is brought to you by the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be speaking with filmmaker and music archivist Cyrus Moussavi. Now, how many filmmaker/music archivists do you know? Yeah, me neither. That is, until I met Cyrus. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you'll know that one thing that fascinates me is how artists sometimes beat their own past to create completely iconoclastic careers. Cyrus has done just that. Raised in Iowa in a bicultural Iranian American household, Cyrus grew up spending summers in Iran and the rest of the year steeped in his father's love of prog rock and his mother's passion for traditional Iranian music. That early immersion in disparate sound worlds laid the groundwork for a lifelong obsession with music. Cyrus is a musician, but he'll be the first to say he's an amateur. What he's really passionate about doing is to approach all types of music as crucial conveyors of culture and history, which strangely is what led him to film. After studying economics and philosophy in college, Cyrus gravitated toward filmmaking, not to make conventional movies, but to explore how visual storytelling could capture, preserve, and transmit music and the lives of those who make it. As a filmmaker, Cyrus has developed a body of work that's both deeply collaborative and boldly inventive. His films include I Snuck Off the Slave Ship, a science fiction documentary co-directed with a visionary artist and musician Lonnie Holley, and the upcoming Somebody's Gone, a feature-length film about gospel legend Brother Theotis Taylor that he's co-directing with Brother Theotis' son, Hubert. And as a music archivist and promoter, since 2019, Cyrus has led the influential Reissue label Mississippi Records, where he works closely with artists and their families to bring overlooked and under-celebrated music from around the world to new audiences. I started off our conversation by asking him how he does his research. He's passionate about celebrating and archiving music that's at risk of being forgotten, so how does he keep his ear to the ground, so to speak, when he has an entire globe to cover?
That's a good question. I worked as a journalist for many years and spent a lot of time abroad in different places and was always listening to music and meeting musicians while doing that. And so I have
What kind of journalism were you doing?
This is where actually the first part of the career started. I was doing short documentary films for NBC about music. So we were doing films about music as it relates to larger social, political, cultural stories. And it was this project I was doing called Raw Music International. And that's sort of where all these different disparate elements, the background in economics, the sort of growing up in between a few different places and a love for music and film came together, where we would document music by nomads in Mongolia as a larger story about climate change and how that's affecting culture. Or we were in Ukraine early in the war. We were in Iraq shortly after the fall of Saddam Hussein. But asking, instead of like the hard news questions, we were finding the musicians and asking them, what's happening?
That's fascinating.
How is life shaping? Yeah.
Why do you think that is kind of a genius way into the larger socio-political conversation? Why is music the perfect entree?
You said genius, I didn't. But I think it is. It's a solid entry point because it's sort of a Trojan horse. You're not forcing people to talk about politics. You're not forcing people to say too much that they might otherwise get in trouble for. But you do allow, somehow musicians have always been allowed a voice that other people aren't allowed within every society. So musicians are pretty good at talking about things in a way that gets them by and allows them to get away with it. In Ethiopia, they call it wax and gold, where you you speak in one way, but it means something else. And I think regardless of where you're from, all musicians have this ability to dance between, you know, the dominant culture where they are and the subcultures in which they exist and do their daily operating. So I think musicians are really fun people to be around. I'm not interested in talking to like military people or economists or oil prospectors. I want to be like, where's the music? What are people doing at night? Where is the most transcendent experience? And take me there. And through that, you learn a lot. You learn about, it's always like the underground too that's more interesting to me. So that's where musicians often take you. Wherever I land, I find a bookshop or a record store, or find the guy busking and playing music and just start talking. And we often find some common ground and something fun comes of it.
How do you build that trust with, especially with an artist that you're going to work with or that you're going to amplify? How do you build a trust, especially if there are language and cultural barriers?
Yeah, I mean, also a very good question, and one that is constantly evolving. I mean, I think a lot of my interest in music also came out of working for an economist who first took me to Kenya for some large NGO project. And I saw this like vast power dynamic between the people who were representing, the UN and these large NGOs and the people who were supposedly benefiting from their services. That felt really uncomfortable and not necessary sometimes. And so music was another way to sort of lessen that gap between two people. You're both musicians, while you recognize that obviously I have a lot of privileges that allow me to even be there in that scenario. I'm not coming as a representative of a large power. I'm coming as, either myself as a musician, artist person, or as a representative of a small record label or an independent film. So automatically that cuts out a lot of the vast gap that occurs between people in these situations. And then a lot of it is just, this sort of feeling tone that they call it. It's just like a human interaction that you have with people. When I was younger, I approached these things very intuitively. And as a result, they were sometimes messy or unclear. As I'm getting older and have done this a lot more, I'm becoming more and more a believer in having very clear agreements in place, very clear expectations before a project starts with people. So there's a lot of cultural work to be done, but there's also like, here are the numbers. This is what this looks like. This is what you get. This is what I get. This is why it's good for me. This is why it's good for you. And I never want to go like, musicians everywhere are struggling. Like I don't ever want to go somewhere and be like operating on vibes. So it's a big combination of like recognizing where people are coming from, being culturally sensitive, being like proficient enough in the language or working with people who are proficient enough in the language and the culture to be able to actually understand what people are trying to tell you. So that's like the human side, the softer cultural side. And then there's just like the hard tack side of like, what is this doing for you? Why are you giving me your time, your energy, your, space? And how are we going to work it out? So it's a combination, and every single one of them is a dance. Some of these relationships are like a couple days and we're recording something, and some of these relationships are years and years and years, and we're building projects together and we're working as collaborators.
You mentioned that sometimes in your travels and you're meeting musicians, you've had some transcendent experiences. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask for an example of a transcendent experience.
There's a lot of times where you're like, I can't believe I'm here. And the original instinct behind this Raw Music International documentary series was to sort of bring you into the room while music was being created. So one musician that really blew me away was Olima Nditi, who was a blind Kenyan guitarist. He was sort of an itinerant musician traveling around these trucking routes between Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And he had an incredible memory. He had like hundreds of songs that he knew. One song in particular, he would sing the names of all these birds, all the birds in the region, and would say, God gave this bird sight. Why did he take it from me? But he delighted people with this incredible ability to just like dip in and out of this ancient history of the Luo people that live in Western Kenya. And I saw him for the first time as a very young person in a bar that some friends had taken me to. It was like a homebrew bar, and everyone was smoking, and it was these drinks out of cans, and Olima was singing his music. And I was like, oh, this is what I've heard about in books and movies. Like, it's happening right here. Of course, that like never happened again. But yeah, there's these moments, or moments much closer to home. I spent several years living in Chicago, and the music scene there is extremely deep, extremely multi-generational, connected, and we would just see music happening in people's homes or in backyards. It was the pandemic, so there's a lot of outdoor music, and I would be like, I feel so privileged to be here right now, to be sharing this moment with people. This is an elevated scenario. This is not normal everyday life, and that's what I'm seeking.
I'd love to talk about your becoming the head of Mississippi Records. You've been there since 2019, right?
Yes.
But the company is 21 years old. So what was it like taking over, becoming the head of this legacy company? And in the last 6 years, what kind of mark did you want to make on the company?
Yeah. So Mississippi Records is a Reissue record label that was founded in Portland, like you said, 21 years ago by Eric Isaacson and a group of other young Portland kind of DIY punk anarchist types who just started releasing records that previously you could only get on much larger record labels. It started doing all this deep research and releasing these really beautiful kind of hand-drawn covers and poetic titles without a lot of information, and really deep cuts, like deep early blues and folk and American music to start, and then expanding wider and wider. And I started hearing this music in college, and as a young person was really inspired both by what I was hearing and also the way it was packaged, I guess, which isn't, they were not packaging things. They were just releasing these art objects. But the way it was received by me was very different from the way I had previously heard, quote unquote, world music or old music, which was in this very stodgy presentation with long liner notes by an expert and sort of like stiff lyric translations and like, they play the instrument this way because of this. This was like, here's music that you can listen to the way you can listen to a punk tape, or the way you can listen to like a burned CDR, and just appreciate it for what it is. It was Mississippi was doing that. Sublime Frequencies was doing that. It was a really liberating feeling where you're like, oh, I can approach music from all over the world as if it's, music in New York, and I don't need to know the history of whatever country it is. I can just appreciate it and listen to it. Again, that was as a very young person. Now I approach it a little bit differently, and I do a lot of research. And one of the things that we do with the label is like deep liner notes and long relationships with the artists. But just to say that like the label was very inspirational to me. Yeah, so I felt like a responsibility to maintain the spirit of Mississippi, maintain what made it so unique and special amongst all these dozens of reissue labels that were popping up in a really kind of square and uninteresting way, in my opinion, while making it a little bit more functional, making it a little bit more streamlined so that it could ultimately pay more to artists and the families that we were working with. And the other thing that I really wanted to make sure we did was that any project we release would be done in collaboration with the musician or their family or their community, that the money would be shared that way, which in those early heady days of all these little punk labels wasn't necessarily the case, partly because there was no money because they're selling the records for so cheap, partly because they were quite isolated people like in the Pacific Northwest who didn't really know these artists. But I felt like this lifetime of travel, this lifetime of being around the world put me in a unique position to make sure that the people who actually made the music were taken care of and that we had relationships with that.
Wow. So that involves a lot more research, especially if the musicians are deceased, right?
Yes, definitely. It involves a lot of research. And that's why the vast majority of projects that come our way just don't happen, because it's a kind of like miraculous series of factors that have to come together to make a project actually work for the label.
What reissue are you proudest of since you became the head of Mississippi Records?
There's a lot of them that have sort of like distilled these ideas that we've been working with. One really important one was the issue of Brother Theotis Taylor's music, who's a gospel singer from South Georgia with this really sublime falsetto voice and this rolling piano style. We met Brother Taylor sort of by chance through Lonnie Holley and his manager. they were like, hey, do you guys want to meet a 92-year-old gospel piano singer? When we were driving through Georgia one day, and we're like, yes, of course. And that album led to a long relationship with Brother Taylor, who's now passed on. He passed away at age 94. And his son, Hubert Taylor, we released his first album of home recordings. He signed his first recording contract of his entire career with us when he was in his 90s, which was something he was very proud of. When the record came out, it got written up. Yeah, it was really cool. It was written up in all these papers. The Guardian interviewed him. And so it felt like we were really able to show him a lot of appreciation and a good time after these decades and decades of making this beautiful music, which he was making not for public recognition, but for very spiritual reasons. And so in some way, it was irrelevant that all this happened, but it was a nice cherry on top of all the work that he had done.
But he was well known in the community of artists and musicians. Right, I see.
Yeah, he's someone who could very well have been a huge name. He sang with Sam Cooke and played at the Apollo and Carnegie Hall even, but he was never interested in that. He was interested in music as a spiritual calling. As he always said, he was not a performer. He didn't perform music. He channeled it, basically. So he was someone I admired very much. Through working with him, I met his son, Hubert Taylor, who had been helping his dad all these years, but had also, through his own sort of spiritual calling, been collecting a massive archive of home video of his community, his family, music, barbecues, funerals, weddings in this small South Georgia town. And he amassed hundreds
did you get
of hours.
access to that?
Yeah, well, that's now becoming a film that we've been working on for several years that will become released by PBS probably next year. So that project just evolved into another project, and that's one that really embodies what I really hope we can do, which is not
and
only
Hubert is very involved, I'm gathering.
Yeah, he's the co-director on the film, so we're in it together. So these are the long-term relationships I'm talking about that I was looking for and I was interested in, and I'm interested in the possibilities that arise through these collaborations, through this sort of insider-outsider approach to working with the material. But so that's one I really love, and I could just name a bunch more. But
well, I'd love to talk about how you created, because clearly you knew you were a fan of Lonnie Holley's work before you approached him to collaborate. Could you talk about how you decided to work together, how you cultivated that relationship?
Yeah, I had seen Lonnie Holley perform in New York years and years ago. I had no idea who he was. He was opening for another musician, and I was just stunned by him and his music and his lyrics. When I found out that he improvises every single song that he performs on the spot, I just couldn't believe it. And I started listening to everything I could, seeing him as often as I could. I just was the ultimate fan. I considered him at the time and now still one of the greatest living artists. And I happened to see him at a small place in New York years later, ran into his manager, started talking, and they were like, hey, we're working on a music video. Are you interested in working on this? And that music video turned into this longer film called I Snuck Off the Slave Ship, based on an 18-minute song of the same title by Lonnie. And, we just really got along early on. And Lonnie has worked in almost every art form possible, but he's never made a film. Though he's a huge fan of films. As a young person, he would sneak into the drive-in movie theater and watch the films secretly, but he didn't have the audio, so he just imagined what they were saying. So we ended up working on this project, and it was one of the first where I was able to very closely collaborate with an artist I respect to transmit or translate their visions into the medium of film, which, like I said, Lonnie knows and loves, but had never made a film. So I saw us and our small film crew, our job was to sort of take all these ideas Lonnie has and be like, okay, how does that look when you have a very small budget and a very small team? And how do you translate that into film? So we called it a science fiction documentary in the end. It was very much about Lonnie, and it was about Lonnie's creative process and sort of reflecting how Lonnie moves through time and his interactions with certain objects. But there was also a lot of imagination and play involved as well. So
you've worked now with musicians of all ages and who've worked across different eras of music and genres. What do you hear from them about how the ecosystem of music has evolved. What is it like for them to make music today in the 21st century in the age of Spotify and Apple Music, if it's at all relevant to them?
It's probably harder than ever to be a musician and make a living from it because there aren't a lot of outlets for getting paid as an artist. A lot of the musicians I work with, they're not like immune to that, but I don't want to say that like the current climate of music and the music industry and music making and getting paid for your music is irrelevant to a lot of the artists I work with because they're almost always working people working with really small budgets, trying to make their projects and their artwork happen regardless of the larger economic landscape. So it is relevant in that they need to make a living, but it's also not relevant because they are making this work for larger reasons, often for the people closest to them, their communities. It's sort of like not
spiritual, you said.
It could be spiritual. It could be, there's a lot of reasons behind it, but it's not really for Spotify and Apple Music. And that's, to me, beautiful. Like that, in a time of artistic abundance, when everything is available on a dot, I love the people who are like, it doesn't have to be that way. It's not for you. You don't get this just because you want it. That, to me, is both an artistic choice. It's also a political choice. It does mean like you have to think about how to exist in a very brutal climate and country without some of those things. And again, that to me is really powerful and really gives me a lot of hope that there are people all over the world choosing to do this. And Mississippi straddles that line between making this music available, hopefully getting people paid a little bit, while not just like dumping it into the ether of like free AI generated content.
Right.
So yeah, it's nice to know that like secrets still exist. Things outside of these ecosystems still exist. There are people creating art not for the masses. And like when I get to hear that, I feel really grateful for it. And I also have to decide alongside the artist if that means it should or should not be released. There's plenty of stuff that we've heard that I love that will just never come out because it's not meant for that. It's not meant for that audience.
Say more about that.
Yeah, like I think it is just like we live in a time of plenty. We live in a time when artists are expected to just give everything they have for free. And there are a lot of people willing to do that.
The expectation is the consumer can just click a button and have access to infinite amount of entertainment and art.
Exactly. Right? They can get it and they don't have to think about it. They don't have to care who it is that made it or where it came from or why it was created. It's just there and it's available. And there are millions of people willing to do that and more than happy to like fall off the side of a bridge to take a selfie. And that's great. Like let them do that. But to me, the real artists are the people who are doing it for other reasons, who can find ways to exist through their communities or through other means of making money while creating this stuff that has nothing to do with this larger atmosphere. And again, like the challenge as a label is like recognizing that, seeking that, idealizing that as one of the higher forms of creation while also being in the business of releasing things to larger groups of people and to larger populations. So when you do come into those special moments where you're engaged with musicians and artists who are like operating at a higher level, you are grateful to hear it and you don't always have to put it out. You can just say, I'm glad I got to hear that. Thank you. And that's, again, something I had to learn over a long period of time.
And so is that a decision that you make or the artist makes, or you both agree?
Oh, yeah, that's completely driven by the artist. I mean, I see myself the same way as like a documentary filmmaker and sort of like compiler and archivist of music. My work is transmitting other people's art into different mediums. So I have my vision for it and I'm going to step in when I know that I have a good idea or that like I know something about this field. But really, like a lot of the decisions about how the music is approached come directly from the artist and come through these long conversations.
How has the music impacted your filmmaking?
That's a really good question. I think my favorite times in filmmaking have been when I've been documenting a live music performance, and I felt that I'm not participating in the musical performance, but also not just being there. Like, I'm operating on a similar wavelength to the musician, so I know where to stand, where to move the camera, where to operate. When I'm really feeling it and I'm really in it, I can anticipate what's happening in the song, even if I've never heard the song before. And in that way, I'm feeling like I'm, part of, like I said, not in the band, but like a cool roadie who who knows what's going on. Like, I'm not in the crowd, but I'm not in the band either. And I get to like sort of move with them and feel like I'm operating on their level. And it's music and film are so different, because music in my favorite forms is one that happens live, that happens in front of you. It could be improvised and spontaneous, but even if it's not, it's a specific like coming together of sounds and energies in a certain space that creates immediate reaction in the audience. Whereas film like spends years and years and years trying to build that similar reaction. It just comes from a different angle. It's a collaborative field with dozens of different people involved, like tinkering infinitely with timing and movement and color in order to get what happens in that like explosive moment in music. And they both work, and they're both really interesting, and they both like do what they do in important and enlightening ways. Like, I learn a lot from each genre, but I really love when the spontaneity of music can be brought into film. And I'm always trying to like keep my eyes open, keep nimble, keep moving. Like, Werner Herzog is one of my favorite film directors, and I've seen videos of him directing. He's like bear hugging the camera person, like moving with him. They're sort of dancing together while he's listening. And I'm like, that I get that. You have to be tapped in and sort of like involved in the movement. So yeah, music has taught me to listen.
And then looking out at, I know you mentioned one project you're currently working on, but looking at the rest of the year, what creative projects are you particularly excited about?
Yeah, well, definitely the film about Brother Theotis Taylor that's working on with Hubert Taylor, his son, is really exciting and taking up a lot of energy. Another project that recently came together is by a Rwandan musician named Bizimungu Dieudonné. I'd heard his tape. His tape was shared with me by a friend many years ago, and I've been trying to track down his family. And finally, I met a really amazing Rwandan journalist who was able to track down his surviving family. He had been killed during the genocide in the 90s. Oh. And so we've been in touch with them. They're very excited about releasing his music, bringing back his memory and his stories. And I'm excited about that project because it's always nice when you reach out to someone and say, hey, I've somehow heard this music that is otherwise very hard to find. I'm interested in releasing it. And they share that interest. They're like, this is important to us. We want this to be out there too. That always means a lot to me, and usually leads to a really powerful project and something that we all learn from. So I'm looking forward to that one. Plus, it's a dark story, but it's upbeat music, and we've been doing a lot of really serious music lately. So I'm looking forward to some jams.
If you'd like to learn more about Cyrus and access a written version of this interview, just head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification button. Lots of fascinating artist conversations coming your way. Also, I'd so appreciate it if you would rate or review Art Restart on whatever platform you use for your podcast listening. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, thank you for listening.